Good morning and Merry Christmas. Hey, I'm glad that you've chose to join with us this morning. And so on behalf of Table Community, man, just Merry Christmas. We're glad that you're here with us. And so you might be going out to another church somewhere today, but if you were planning to come to Table Community, if you get here, you'll find that the doors are locked and there's no one here. And that's simply because we're a church plant and there's a lot of people that were moving and traveling. And so we just decided, hey, we're just going to celebrate Christmas Eve in our homes. And so if you're not doing anything this morning and it's before 10:30, hey, we want to invite you. I want to invite you over to my house. You can come to my house. And so we're going to be at our houses. And if you come to my house, you'll be there and there'll be some friends there. And we're going to invite some neighbors over that don't normally have transportation. And so they can't go to a Christmas Eve service. And so we're going to just do it in our home. And so we want to invite you to celebrate that with us. And so if you're watching this is actually our Christmas Eve message, and so we're glad that you're here with us. And so Christmas is a time of list. I mean, people have Christmas lists. I mean, kids have Christmas lists. You put all your toys and all the things that you want on the Christmas list, and then you send those things to Santa. And as an adult, you have Christmas lists, but those are typically the presents that you have to buy for other people. And so you've got all these names of people and all the kind of the different dollar amounts, and what might be the best present for that kind of person. And you have a list of things that you have to do and just all the different places you have to be and events that you have to be part of that are just part of the holiday season. And then you have a list of the people that you are going to spend time with, of your family and your friends and the people that have come back into town. And so Christmas is a time of list. It's a time of Christmas list. And in the Bible, we actually have some Christmas lists, right? And so the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, there are these lists, and they begin with these, before they tell kind of the Jesus birth story, they begin with these lists of Jesus's ancestors, these lists of who came before Jesus and where Jesus came from, and this is the stuff you don't normally read, like unless you're reading like as part of a Bible reading plan, and then you just feel guilty because you skipped it and you're not allowed to skip sections. And so, but these lists are here and they're there for a reason. And Matthew has a list and the Gospel of Luke has a list, and they're actually different lists. They list different people because, there's different ways to work your way up a family tree. But both of the lists agree that Jesus was a descendant of Sarah and of Abraham and of King David. And so with that comes the hope of the prophets and the promise of God. And it really looks back from their perspective on kind of this golden era of David, who was this strong ruler, this time of military might and just all that was King David, and just kind of the climax, what they thought leading up to Jesus before, the ministry of Jesus. This was kind of the peak of Israel's history when things were going best. And so they're saying this is where Jesus came from. And in Luke's gospel, it begins with Jesus and it works backward to Abraham, and then it works on from there to Adam, right? And it says, the son of Enoch, the son of Jared, the son of Mahalalel, the son of Canaan, the son of Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, and then it says the Son of God. And so the Son of God, this is very important for you to understand about who Jesus is. It's this interesting term that means to find your origin in, right? And so to say that someone is the Son of God is to say that they find their origin in God. This is true whether we're talking about Jesus or we talk about ourselves as part of God's family. To say that you are a son or a daughter of God is to say that you find your origin, you find your identity in God. And at the time that this was written, this was also a socio-political term that emperors would use. Nero would say that he was the Son of God, right? And so that was kind of their way of claiming divine power for themselves. So when the Gospels open up with this and they say that Jesus is the Son of God, these early documents would have actually been a challenge to the authorities of the time, that the Gospels would have been somewhat of a dangerous document. And Luke is doing that, but he's doing more than just that, okay? When he suggests that Jesus is the son of Adam, he's saying more than he's just the biological son of Adam. He's saying that somehow in Jesus, there's a new beginning for the human race, a new Genesis, right? And just like Adam bore the image of God as the original human, right? And although that image is skewed and it's off, right? But now in Jesus, like Adam, reflects the image of God, but he does it clearly and brightly, and there's a brilliance to it and just a clarity of what it means to be human that we find in Jesus. And there's a clarity of what it means to see God in Jesus. And so there's this sense that in Jesus, humanity finds a fresh start. And so Christmas is about a fresh start, and some of us feel that need. We feel that, hey, I need a fresh start. And Jesus is here to lead us into a new humanity, a renewed humanity, right? And so there's all these terms that are used in there. When he says that he's the son of David, he's talking about Jesus has come to do what? He's come to model a new type of leadership. When he says that Jesus is the son of Abraham, he's saying that Jesus is modeling the blessing and the promises that God has given us in the Old Testament and for our lives. And to call Jesus the Son of God is to expect Jesus to model true humanity, what it means to be human to us. And so Jesus does this. God does this by placing Jesus into our humanity. And with that comes all the ugliness and messiness that is part of humanity. In Matthew's list, he does something really very interesting. Matthew includes 5 women, right? And so that's not normal for the time when it's still not normal today, actually, when you create an ancestral list. Usually it's kind of the firstborn all the way up, right? And so women are not typically on there, right? People don't, typically when we go back and we trace our ancestry, we do it first through our father's side, and then secondly, because that's our namesake most of the time in most cultures, and then through our mother's side. And so women aren't typically included. And in the ancient Near Eastern culture, they certainly would have been included, because you got to understand this is a pre-scientific culture, and so their understanding of women was basically just they just considered them as vessels for children, right? They didn't understand that there was a human egg, right, and that the human egg wasn't known about. And so men got all the credit for their contribution, and women were just kind of vessels, right? And so they weren't really counted, right? And so it would have been absurd for them to be found in this list. And so it's impressive that Matthew bothers to include women's contribution in the line of Jesus at all. But from a cultural vantage point, it does not strengthen his story. It doesn't strengthen the credibility of Jesus. But we're going to see that Jesus is trying to tell a different type of story. And so there's 5 women listed here. The first one is Tamar. And who is Tamar? Tamar is a prostitute. And the next one you see is Rahab. And Rahab is a foreign prostitute who works as a spy. And then you have Ruth and Boaz. They're listed. And you got to understand that she was a foreigner who had a sexual liaison with a Jewish man who was known for being wealthy. And then there's Bathsheba, right? And she, that's not a name you typically name your kids, right? She's in the story of David. She's this Israelite woman who was married to a foreigner but was forced into a sexual relationship with a king. And finally, Mary is listed, right? And right now we give Mary lots of props, but at the time you have to understand who Mary was. She was Joseph's fiance, but she was pregnant, and she was claiming to be divinely pregnant. And honestly, if anybody tells me that they're divinely pregnant, I'm going to be a little bit skeptical, okay? And so it's not normal to include women's names on the ancestral list to begin with, and these are the kind of women typically that, especially in this culture, you would want to bury in your past. These are not the kind of people that you would want to honor in your list and put them in a gospel and something that's going to tell the story of who Jesus is, unless the story of Jesus is something and someone who is drastically different than anyone we've ever known. And that's part of Matthew's point, is that when Jesus comes to us, when Jesus steps into humanity, he doesn't step into a pristine group of people. He steps into the messy story that's Israel, and the messy story that's the Gentile story. It's the messy story that's the story of the world, and it's a broken story. It's a story that affects broken poor families and broken rich families, and nobles and normal people and kings and peasants, and Jesus steps into humanity, steps into it with all that comes with it, right? And so when Jesus descends on the earth, he doesn't descend from heaven like a god, right? Because we're going to look as we see in Jesus' life that the economy of Jesus, the economy of grace, it doesn't work as kind of this top-down thing. It works, there's no trickle-down policies in God's economy, right? The new life that we find in Jesus is a life that begins from the bottom up. We see a story in Jesus that's a grassroots effort, right? That God's grace doesn't trickle down, but instead we find in Jesus someone who comes lowly in a manger, who stoops low to lift others up. And we see this all throughout the Christmas story. There's the shepherds, right? The shepherds are undeserving messengers, right? And this is part of what it means for Jesus to be a son of David, is that there's this connection that the message of Jesus is coming through shepherds. And so what you need to understand about shepherds is, man, they were not the wealthiest people. Shepherds were typically the youngest in the family, just like David was, the youngest in the family. And so they were put out to become a shepherd because their place wasn't really that important. And because you were the youngest, it means that when the family inheritance was passed down from generation to generation, it was going to skip right over you. You weren't really going to get any of that. And so to become a shepherd was really someone who had no hope of having a better life. And yet in the Jesus story, in the Christmas story, we see that shepherds get a front row seat to the good news for all people, that the lowest in humanity receive the announcement of Jesus first. And so the poor, they always had this special place in the kingdom of God. In the Old Testament, there's this practice when, you go through and you pick your crops, right? You weren't supposed to go back through and clean up all the stuff that you missed behind you. In fact, you were going to miss some stuff, and that was okay because you actually left that stuff so that the poor and the landless, that they could glean kind of from the margins of your prosperity, right? And so the poor, we see they're just central to the ministry of Jesus, right? In his parables, the poor are comforted by God even when they don't receive any compassion from society, any compassion from the rich. And Jesus taught to give generously to the poor even though society viewed them as a problem, as a curse, as a hindrance. And today we look at our world and, there's 3 billion people, they live on less than $2.50 a day. And 75% of the world's poor, they depend on agriculture for their livelihood. And so that's a reality that most of us, maybe none of us, live with. And so the poor, they spend upwards of 75% of everything they make just to eat, just for food, just to survive. In America, usually about 10% of our budget, that's the average, goes toward food. And there's 750 million people that don't have access to clean water, and there's 40 million children who don't have adequate shelter, and roughly about 1 billion people in the world cannot read or write. So that's around 1 in 7 people. And so as you gather your family together this Christmas, you're going to take time and you're going to celebrate and you're going to unwrap presents. And Christmas is just fun. Especially if you have kids, it's just one of the best days of the year. But I want you to take time. I want you to consider, and if you light an Advent candle, light a candle for the people who are like the women on Jesus' Christmas list, on Jesus' ancestral list, for the poor, for the marginalized, for the vulnerable, for the hungry, for those who lack shelter, for those who lack proper nutrition, for people who don't have drinking water, for people who are just desperate to know that they're not forgotten. And so as you move into Christmas, spend time and celebrate, but take time to pray for those who are vulnerable and just at a tough place in life, because we know that they're counted on God's list. And And even though they might not show up on some of our Christmas lists, and they should, we know that they're counted on God's Christmas list. And I just pray that God would reveal the unseen people to you, the people that don't make it onto the list. I pray that God would show them to you, and God would allow you to interact into their lives. And maybe you and your family, you need to find a way to give to those who are in need this holiday season, and not make it all about you and what you're doing and your family and the celebration, and all that's good and wonderful. But take time to realize that when Jesus came to step into our story, he came to step into our brokenness and to meet us in our brokenness. And not just our spiritual brokenness, but our physical brokenness. And I just ask that you kind of find time and pray that God would show you those unseen people in your lives. And then I pray that you would reach out to those who you know just need to feel like they're known this season. You know, a pastor of mine once told me that to be loved is to be known, right? And to love someone this Christmas season is to know them and to make them feel as if they're known. Last week, our church table community took up our offering, and we gave it all away. And so that money we were able to use last week's offering to buy a couple of different local families who have kids who they honestly just couldn't afford to do Christmas for in the way that you'd want to do Christmas. And so we were able to give that money to those families, and they're able to buy Christmas presents for their children. And our hope there is that they would feel known, that they would feel loved here at Christmas, because God remembers them. And even if no one else, even if they don't make it on anyone else's Christmas list, we know that they're counted on God's list. Hey, we love you here at Table Community. We're glad that you joined us for this message. We just want to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We'll see you later.